our next segment. Um, this is, I think it might be the longest one that we have of the day. John Mearsheimer recently went on Lex Fridman. Mearsheimer is one of those somewhat rational liberals, not a communist, not a socialist, ideologically not aligned with the forces of humanity and the proletariat, but he's someone who has a somewhat pragmatic, commonsensical understanding of things, and that even if his interests lie with imperialism, he's a little smarter than most folks. And we saw this in some of his analysis concerning the proxy war against Russia, and we'll see this now with some of his analysis on the situation in Israel. I might be wrong. I don't know much about him. I might look him up later today and see that he's been calling himself a communist for 20 years or something. I doubt it, but I do think he's one of these positive, rational liberals that we could listen to.
Let me ask you about, you mentioned the Israel lobby. You wrote a book, probably your most controversial book on the topic.
Not probably. Clearly the most controversial book I ever wrote.
So you've criticized Israel.
Hialeah, la ciudad que progresa. Yeah, we used to have so many sayings. Hialeah, agua, fango, y factoría. That's another one. Hialeah, water, mud, and factories. That was like the slogan of the city.
Lobby in the United States for influencing U.S. policy in the Middle East. Can you explain what the Israel lobby is, their influence, and your criticism over the past, let's say, a couple decades?
Well, the argument that Steve Walt and I made, actually, we wrote an article first, and which appeared in the London Review of Books, and then we wrote the book itself. Our argument is that the lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that push American policy in a pro-Israel direction. And basically, the lobby is interested in getting getting the United States, and here we're talking mainly about the American government, to support Israel no matter what Israel does. And our argument is that if you look at the relationship between the United States and Israel, it's unprecedented in modern history. This is the closest relationship that you can find between any two countries in recorded history. It's truly amazing the extent to which Israel and the United States are joined at the hip. And we support Israel no matter what, almost all the time. And our argument is that is largely due to the influence of the lobby. The lobby is an extremely...
You see, like, I would consider this a form of false consciousness, because he's making Israel the cause of the U.S.'s support for Israel, when in reality it's the other way around. By supporting Israel, its colonial outpost in the Middle East, what the U.S. is doing is supporting the interest of U.S. imperialism. So this is, again, where some of these liberal frameworks completely miss the mark, or get to the mark and then turn it around, see it upside down, because they don't have the analysis that's rooted in political economy and in an analysis of imperialism. If you have an analysis rooted in imperialism, it's not the Israeli lobby that governs the U.S. or whatever. Yes, the Israeli lobby has an influence, but what creates the conditions for the possibility of the Israeli lobby? That's a fancy Kantian way of asking the question: where does the Israeli lobby and Israel itself arise from? It's a colonial outpost of Western, now U.S.-led imperialism. So he's got it somewhat flipped around.
Really powerful interest group. Now, it's very important to understand that the American political system is set up in ways that allow interest groups of all sorts to wield great influence. So in the United States, you have an interest group or a lobby like the National Rifle Association that makes it well nigh impossible to get gun control.
What if I told you that there's a country where small groups of very rich people give money to the tunes of tens and sometimes hundreds of millions to politicians so that policies that favor those groups, even when they're deeply antagonistic to the general populace, are implemented. What would you call that? I think most people would very clearly call that corruption, and the system that the political system, how it functions, they would call that an oligarchy. But no, that's the U.S. In the U.S., we call it lobbyism, and the political system, we call it democracy, liberal democracy. It's absurd. It's a turning of reality upside down in order to allow that reality to continue to reproduce itself.
Control,
Yeah.
right? And so with the Israel lobby, you have this group of individuals and organizations that wield enormous influence on U.S. policy toward the Middle East. And this is not surprising given the nature of the American political system. So our argument is that the lobby is not doing anything that's illegal or illicit or immoral or unethical. It's just a good old-fashioned American interest group. And it just happens to be extremely powerful. And our argument is that this is not good for the United States because no two countries have the same interests all the time. And when our interests conflict with Israel's interests, we should be able to do what we think is in our national interest, in America's national interest. But the lobby tends to conflate.
One of the things he's doing here is speaking about our interests in a very abstract way. If when you think about American interests, you think about the interests of the American people, then literally fucking nothing the American government does represents American interests, right? So then when you take it to the relationship that the US has with Israel, it becomes very clear that it's not in our interest. But when we speak about American interests in this way, should it be the interest of the American people that we assume is behind things? No. There's a specific interest within America, the interest of the elite, that keep us exploited, oppressed, poor, alienated, depressed, stressed, traumatized. It's that group of people whose interests are aligned with Israel simply because Israel as an entity cannot be separated from this group of people that are the personifications of capitalist imperialism. Even, Netanyahu, where did he grow up? What country? What schools did he go to? Who was he constantly rubbing elbows with? That's the case for the vast majority of Israeli politicians. So,
America's national interest with Israel's national interest and wants the United States to support Israel no matter what. We also argue, and I cannot emphasize this enough given what's going on in the world today, that the lobby's effects, the lobby has not been pushing policies that are in Israel's interest. So our argument is that the lobby pushes policies that are not in America's interest or not in Israel's interest. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly does he mean by that? What every president since Jimmy Carter has tried to do, as I said before, is to foster a two-state solution, to push Israel, which is the dominant player in Greater Israel, push Israel to accept the two-state solution. And we have run into huge resistance from the lobby whenever we tried to, let's be blunt about it, coerce Israel, right? In a perfect world where there was no lobby and an American president was free to put pressure on Israel, to coerce Israel, I believe we would have gone a long way towards getting two-state solution. And I believe this would have been in Israel's interest.
That's not true. It's been shown that as soon as any US president says, yo, chill out, Israel just follows what the US says. That's something that is empirically confirmable. There's a direct correlation between when the US gives the thumbs down to something Israel is doing and when it stops. That's why it's so important to get our government to pressure Israel into a ceasefire, because the people that call the shots are here. It's the US that funds and equips Israel with the weapons that are carrying forth a genocide. So, if you want to snip Israel as a settler colonial proxy of imperialism, you have to snip it at the root. And the root of Israel is the U.S. and the U.S. imperialist system. It's the bastard baby of Western imperialism, as Kwame Ture was fond of saying.
But we couldn't get a two-state solution because it was almost impossible to put meaningful pressure on Israel because of the lobby. So this was not in Israel's interest, and it was not in America's interest. And that was the argument that we made. And we, of course, got huge pushback for making that argument.
What's the underlying motivation of the lobby? Is it religious in nature? Is it similar to the way war hawks are sort of militaristic in nature? Is it nationalistic in nature? What's if you were to describe this loose coalition of people, what would you say is their motivation?
Well, first of all, I think you have to distinguish between Jews and Christians. You want to remember that there are a huge number of Christians.
It's crazy because Lex Fridman visited, I can't remember if it was Gaza or the West Bank. And he did some helpful videos from there. He allowed a few Palestinian people to speak their mind, and was seen by millions of folks. So you would think that he'd be capable of making some of these connections, like, oh yeah, what I saw were people living in an apartheid state in what has been described by folks in the UN and within the higher-ups of Israel as an open-air prison, what some have described as a concentration camp. You would think that he'd be understanding of an event like October 7th. Like, what the fuck else would you do if you were living in a concentration camp and every peaceful attempt you've had to change your condition has been squashed, people have been murdered, injured? Every peaceful attempt, the same path that Hamas was able to break through on October 7th, there was a march there in 2019, I believe. Hundreds of people were shot. Many killed. So when that peaceful route fails, what else do you do? You just lay down and give up and submit and let yourself be the subjects that are destroyed every time Israel periodically mows the lawn, as it's fond of saying? No, you grab arms and you fight by the only means that the occupying colonial force has left you to achieve freedom. So if Lex saw those conditions, and I can't remember whether he traveled to Gaza or the West Bank, you would think that he'd be able to put two and two together, especially as he fancies himself as this very smart nerd guy. But no, he doesn't. And you see it in the way that he asks Mearsheimer these questions.
Zionists who are deeply committed to Israel no matter what, right? And then there are a large number of Jews. The Jews are obviously the most important.
Thank you so much, Cordy, for the $2.79 Canadian dollar super chat. They always speak English at the UN, not Hebrew. Yeah, absolutely. And because you know who they're speaking to. You know, they're speaking to their parent. If your parent only spoke Spanish, as mine do I go up to them and speak in English? No, if I want to be a good son, I speak to them in Spanish. And that's, of course, what Israel does. And a lot of the propaganda, you understand that is so tailored to the U.S. because, like the one that they did when they were pretending to give aid to Gaza, where they put in front of a bunch of empty boxes, in big, bold English, they put medical supplies or medical aid. Forget what it was specifically that they put. Who's that for? Who is that propaganda aimed at convincing? Well, the only people whose consent is absolutely fundamental for them to continue carry on their activities, which is the American public. So, but thank you so much for the super chat.
Of those two groups in the Israel lobby. But, one of the arguments that we made in the book is that you should not call it the Jewish lobby because it's not populated just by Jews, and Christian Zionists are an important part of that lobby. But furthermore, there are a good number of Jews who are opposed to the lobby and the policies that the lobby purveys. And there are a number of Jews who are prominent anti-Zionists, right? So, and they're obviously not in the lobby. Or if you take a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, right? Jewish Voice for Peace is not in the lobby. So it's wrong to call it a Jewish lobby. But with regard to the American Jews who are in that lobby, I think that really this is all about nationalism. It's not so much religion. Many of those Jews who are influential in the lobby are not religious in any meaningful sense of that term, but they self-identify as Jewish in the sense that they feel they're part of a Jewish nation, and that in addition to being an American, right, they are part of this tribe, this nation called Jews, and that they have a responsibility to push the United States in ways that support the Jewish state. So I think that's what drives most, if not almost all the Jews. This is not to say there's not a religious dimension for some of them, but I think that the main connection is much more tribal in nature.
So I had a conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said fundamentally, if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. So the Zionist project is tied at the hip to the Jewish project. What
Oh, here's another big mistake. It's what he's saying is true. It's not a religious issue in the sense that, yeah, some of the most ardent anti-Zionists and some of the first deeply anti-Zionist folks were the Orthodox Jews. He's absolutely right about that. He's wrong to claim that it is this tribal national thing. No, it's not nationalism that's driving this. The sort of Jewish nationalism is the justification for the real drives, which are rooted in political economy, in the geopolitical role that Israel plays as a colonial outpost of U.S. imperialism. It's that simple. That's why Israel was created, and that's what Israel has always functioned as. The Jewish nationalism that he's describing is just the mask that's put on in order to justify the real reasons why they're doing what they're doing.
do you have to say to that?
Look, you can define anti-Semitism any way you want, right? And you can define anti-Semitism to incorporate anti-Zionism. And I think we have reached the point where anti-Semitism is identified today, not just with anti-Zionism, but with criticism of Israel. If you criticize Israel, some people will say, you're an anti-Semite. And if that's your definition of anti-Semitism, it's taken.
And we just talked about this. There was a vote in the House attempting to systematize this equating of critiques of Zionism and Israel with anti-Semitism. Everyone, with the exception of one Republican from Kentucky, Thomas Massey, everyone voted in favor of it, with the exception of Thomas Massey that voted against it, and Rashida Tlaib that very cowardly voted present. So they're trying to institutionalize this ideological trick that has always been present, which is the equating of critiques of the imperialist fascistic state of Israel with anti-Semitism.
An important term and stretched it to the point where it's meaningless, right? So when Steve and I wrote the book, wrote the article and then wrote the book, all sorts of people said that we were anti.
By the way, if that thing they voted on passes, that means that everything we're doing and everything that students are doing in colleges and people are doing in the streets, it will be considered hate speech, which means that we can be repressed, we can be attacked, we can be incarcerated, because criticizing Israel and Zionism and its genocidal war against the Palestinians will be equated with you being anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish.
Semites. This is a ludicrous charge, but what they meant was you're criticizing the lobby, you're criticizing Israel, and therefore you're an anti-Semite. Okay, if that's what an anti-Semite is, somebody who criticizes Israel, probably half the Jewish community, if not more in the United States, is anti-Semitic. And of course, you get into all these crazy games where people are calling Jews self-hating Jews and anti-Semites because they're critical of Israel. But even people who are anti-Zionist, I don't think they're anti-Semitic at all. You can argue they're misguided. That's fine. But many of these people are Jewish and proud of the fact that they're Jewish. They just don't believe that nationalism and Jewish nationalism is a force that should be applauded. And you want to understand that in the American context, there is a rich tradition of anti-Zionism, right? And these were not people who were anti-Semites, if you go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s. And the same thing was even true in Europe. There were all sorts of European Jews who were opposed to Zionism. Were they anti-Semites? I don't think so. But we've gotten to the point now where people are so interested in stopping any criticism of Israel that they wield this weapon of calling people anti-Semites so loosely that the term has kind of lost meaning. So I think Netanyahu is wrong-headed to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Alan Dershowitz was one of the people that called you specifically anti-Semitic. So just looking at the space of discourse, how do you, where's the slither of hope for healthy discourse about U.S. relationships with Israel between you and Alan Dershowitz and others like him?
Well, I think until there is a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's no hope of putting an end to this nonsense, right?
So these are just uses of terms to kind of cheat your way through the discourse.
It's
shortcut.
No, it's to silence people. Right? It's very, very important to understand that one of the lobby's principal goals is to make sure we don't have an open discourse, a freewheeling discourse about Israel, because they understand, people in the lobby understand that if you have an open discourse, Israel will end up looking very bad. Right? You don't want to talk about the occupation. You don't want to talk about how Israel was created. Right? All these subjects are ones that will cause problems for Israel. See, just to go to the present crisis, okay? When you have a disaster, and what happened on October 7th is a disaster, one of the first things that happens is that people begin to ask the question, how did this happen? Right? What's the root cause of this problem? This is a disaster. We have to understand what caused it so that we can work to make sure it doesn't happen again. So we work to shut it down and then make sure it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. But once you start talking about the root causes, right, you end up talking about how Israel was created, right? And that means telling a story that is not pretty about how the Zionists conquered Palestine. And number two, it means talking about the occupation. Right? It's not like Hamas attacked on October 7th because there were just a bunch of anti-Semites who hated Jews and wanted to kill Jews. This is not, Nazi Germany, right? This is directly related to the occupation and to what was going on inside of Gaza. And it's not in Israel's interest or the lobby's interest to have an open discourse about what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians since, I would say, roughly 1903, when the second Aliyah came to Israel or came to what was then Palestine, right? We want to talk about that. And we don't want to talk about, from the lobby's point of view, the influence that the lobby has, right?
Here he's absolutely correct. Any person that asks themselves that question, which is the vast majority of people, you hear the narrative of what happened on October 7th, you're shocked, you're like, how did this happen? The how naturally leads you to investigating, and it doesn't take much investigation to see what Mearsheimer, I'm so troubled by the pronunciation. Mearsheimer is saying, which is that what happened on October 7th is a direct effect. It's a production of the last 70-some years of occupation, apartheid. It's the natural effect. It was bound to happen. So it's that's why discourse needs to be censored. So that people do not see the truth of the factors that led to the fact of October 7th.
It's better from the lobby's point of view if most Americans think that American support of Israel is just done for all the right moral and strategic reasons, not because of the lobby. And when John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt come along and say, you have to understand that this special relationship is due in large part to the lobby's influence, that is not an argument that people in the lobby want to hear. So the point is, you have to go to great lengths for all these reasons. You have to go to great lengths to silence people like me and Steve Walt. And one of the ways to do that is to call us anti-Semites. I think the chapter or the section of the book where we talk about this charge of anti-Semitism is called The Great Silencer. That's what we call the charge of anti-Semitism, the Great Silencer. Who wants to be called an anti-Semite, especially in the wake of the Holocaust? Do I want to be called an anti-Semite? Oh my God, no. So it's very effective. But, it is important to talk about these issues, in my humble opinion. And I think if we had talked about these issues way back when, it would have gone a long way towards, maybe getting a two-state solution, which I think was the best.
We can't talk about these issues because in order for all of these political agendas to become actual and to continue being in place, the people need to be convinced. The people, you need consent. It doesn't matter how fascistic or totalitarian a state is. It cannot survive on the basis of coercion. You always need a certain level of consent. And consenting to this issue would mean a few things. Either convincing people of the narrative that you built, and if you can't do that, eliminating the possibility of any of those people encountering an alternative way of thinking about the events in front of them. Censorship is a central component for sustaining hegemony, for sustaining the consent of the masses, of the mass of people. And it intensifies in those moments where that consent is dwindling, where people are not accepting the dominant narrative and are opening themselves up to alternative ways of thinking about events, and if it gets even deeper than that, alternative ways of thinking about the world itself, alternative worldviews. So when you see censorship intensify, as we are seeing in our era, you know that that is the ruling class assuring themselves that even if less people buy into their narrative, at the very least, they won't find the contrary. Because they're okay with empty critique. That's why they love the Western Marxists. You know, they allow Zizek to go up on a stage and debate Peterson as a representative of Marxism. They love, teaching the Frankfurt School and the French theory and in the academy. Why? Because it's a form of empty critique. It paradoxically does that thing. Hegel said every negative always has a positive. Yeah, but the positive of this critique is the reaffirmation of that thing being critiqued, precisely because the critique provides no alternative. And so when you just critique, but then literally every other alternative in the world that's presented to the thing that you're critiquing, to the capitalist system, whether it's socialist countries or countries that are not socialist but outside of the sphere of influence of empire, you condemn. Of course, the ruling class is going to be perfectly fine with allowing you to speak as much as possible. Your critique is empty. It has no positive content. It has nothing that it points to as an alternative.
Alternative here.
It's complicated, and I wonder if you can comment on the complexity of this, because criticizing Israel and criticizing the lobby can, for a lot of people, be a dog whistle for sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That this idea that Jews run everything, run the world, or this kind of cabal, and it's also very true that people who are legitimately anti-Semitic are also critics of Israel in the same kind of way. And so it's such a complicated landscape in which to have discussions, because even people like David Duke, who are racist, don't sound racist on the surface. Well, I haven't listened to him enough, but there's dog whistles. It's a complicated space in which to have discussions, because I wonder if you can sort of speak to that, because there's
if there's something that I would let pass from the Frankfurt School, it's specifically the chapter on the culture industry from Dialectics of Enlightenment, because I do think that analysis is true. But again, like where's the positive content? Here's the socialist alternative. Here's how we see it in socialist countries constructing their new societies, riddled still by contradictions, produced by the pressures of imperialism. That's what's missing. But some of the analysis on the culture industry, I do appreciate.
This silencing effect of calling everybody anti-Semitic. But it's also true that there is anti-Semitism in the world. Like, there is a sizable population of people that hate Jews. There's probably a sizable population of people who hate Muslims too. But
a lot of hate out there.
But the hatred of Jews has like a long history, and so you have Rolling Stones have a set of great hits, and there's just a set of great hits of the ways conspiracy theories you can make up about the Jews that are used as part of the hatred. So there's like nice templates for that, and I just wonder if you can comment on operating as a historian, as an analyst, as a strategic thinker in this kind of space?
Yeah, we obviously, when we wrote the article, which we did before the book, gave this subject a great deal of thought. I mean, what you say just now is music to our ears. I'm talking about me and Steve. I mean, I think that your point about dog whistles is correct. Look, we went to great lengths to make it clear that this is not a cabal, it's not conspiracy, and in fact, in a very important way, the lobby operates out in the open, right? Uh, they brag about their power, right? And this was true before we wrote the article, right? And we said in the article and the book, and you heard me say it here. First of all, it's not a Jewish lobby, right? Um, Secondly, it's not a cabal, right? It's an American interest group, and
And the American system is designed such that interest groups are perfectly legal, and some of them are super effective.
exactly. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly right. And and it was
Again, that's where they're wrong, or at least one-sided, because it's not the case that the Israeli interest group is the root of the American policy with relationship to Israel. The opposite is the case. It's the need of the U.S. empire to have something like Israel in the Middle East that Biden has repeated over and over again. If there wasn't an Israel, we would have to create one. It's that need that creates Israel and then reciprocally creates, the entity of AIPAC and the Israel lobby that influences more immediately and directly specific politicians and political institutions.
nothing that we said that was anti-Semitic by any reasonable definition of that term. And huge numbers of Jews have known me and Steve over the years, and nobody ever said that we were anti-Semitic before March 2006 when the article appeared, because we're not anti-Semitic. But look, you've got this interest group, right, that has a significant influence on American policy and on Israeli policy, and you want to talk about it. It's just important to talk about it. It's important for Jews, right, in the United States, for Jews in Israel, to talk about this. The idea that you want to silence critics is not a smart way to go about doing business, in my opinion. If we were wrong, if Steve and I were so wrong and our arguments were so foul, they could have easily exposed those arguments. They could have gone into combat with us in terms of the marketplace of ideas and easily knocked us down. The problem was that our arguments were quite powerful. And instead of engaging us and defeating our arguments, they wanted to silence us. And this is not good, right? It's not good for Israel. It's not good for the United States. And I would argue in the end, if anything, it's going to foster anti-Semitism. I think you don't want to run around telling people that they can't talk about Israel without being called an anti-Semite. It's just not, it's not healthy in terms of the issue that you're raising, right? But I still agree with you that it is a tricky issue. I don't want to make light of that. I know that there's this piece of literature out there called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I fully understand that if you're not careful, you can come close to writing volume 2 of the protocol. But I don't believe that we wrote anything that was even close to that. And again, I think that a healthy debate on the issues that we were raising would have been not only in America's interest, but it would have been in Israel's interest.
There you go. Somewhat sensible, liberal view of the current state of affairs, still forced to admit some of the central facts of the ongoing occupation and apartheid state that the Palestinian people live under, a condition described by the UN and Human Rights Group as an open-air prison, described by some as a concentration camp, some in the Israeli government themselves, and a general state that has been called by the United Nations, Human Rights, forget what the organization, Human Rights Association, or and other various human rights international organizations as apartheid. So once you have those facts, what else do you need? So that was the last Palestine segment of the day. Now we have the